in order to do the policies that you are required, you not only have to win the policy battle, but you also need to win the narrative and the changing, no, certain values and constructions that society as hierarchical as Mexican society has already.
Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel, presented by Traces.Dreams. Today I'm here with Diego Vazquez. Diego's an economist, and he's also the Director of Investigation of Research at Oxfam Mexico. Diego specializes on economic development and data issues. And we want to talk today about a study that they conducted at Oxfam, where Diego was involved last year. Diego's going to tell us all about it. It's related to data and inequality. Welcome to the show, Diego.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks for the invitation, and happy to discuss these issues about urban inequality and data.
Well, we're very happy to learn about these issues, and I'd like to ask to start off with what this famous report that you published last year called Big Data and Urban Inequality, slightly oddly translated, what it's about.
Yes, so thank you. Basically, the report tried to apply certain type of analysis using big data information to analyze the patterns of mobility within Mexico City. And this report is relevant because normally economists or other social science rely heavily on census data or survey data. So making an inequality analysis with those databases normally takes time, no? Because at most you have to wait up until 10 years, if you're lucky enough, 5 years, to obtain disaggregated level of data that allows you to do this type of analysis, no? About how people is distributed in terms of their social class or their economic status, no? Around the city. So what we did was to actually use information from mobile phones to sort of trying to determine which were the patterns of mobility in Mexico City, and trying to see basically if the upper middle class and upper classes live or interact in the same space as people who lived in low income zones in the city, no? And basically what we found is that the mobility patterns in terms of use of public spaces, consumption, leisure, or education were completely different, no? It was like living in two different cities, no? And for me, it was quite shocking, not to see not only inequality in terms of the concentration of economic resources such as wealth or income, but also to see these in terms of the spaces we use to meet with other people, no? And obviously this creates a sort of alienation, no? Between social groups, no? In which basically what we call or what sociologists call the otherness, no? The things that you assume about the other like increase, no? Because rather than to live with other types of people every day, people normally just interact with similar people in the public space, no? That I think has very important consequences, no? Not only in terms of inequality per se, but also in terms of social cohesion, no?
If you could talk a little bit more about these consequences. I mean, the report is fittingly titled Parallel Worlds or Parallel Universes in Spanish in its original title. There is something about space that relates to a specific class, what you can find in your report. There is spaces where people dine, or where people go to museums, or where people go to school, or where people go for leisure, that are completely separate between classes. So some restaurants in some specific areas are frequented only by people of upper classes, and others are frequented only by people of lower classes. So you find a complete split between these. I'm interested in what are these consequences, and also how do they spatially divide?
Yes, so the first consequence is that these places become a symbolic consequence in terms of the people who, even the aesthetics and all the symbolic consequences in terms of power that surround those places of the higher upper middle class. But there's also very significant economic consequences, no? The first economic consequence, I think, and most straightforward, are the process of gentrification. And this process you can clearly see it in downtown Mexico City, in places such as, and people perhaps your viewers in Mexico should relate with these neighborhoods, no? Condesa, Roma, no? All these places that are close to downtown, it seems to be that there are, and also places like for top of the top class such as Polanco, the real estate property and the prices tend to go up, no? And this process of a certain consumption in certain spaces, what it creates is a sort of bubble in prices, no? And you can see that with property. And basically what we have is that zones that are frequented by only by upper classes in Mexico City, what they tend to create is that they exclude, no, by this dynamic of prices, exclude significant segments of the population from the access to that space, which means access to proper public services, no? Because they are the zones that have more infrastructure in terms of transport and basic services, no? So this process obviously creates zones that were historically popular zones have become sort of zones for a certain privileged class, no, that occupies now those zones. So that is the first like economic effect. The second economic effect is this sort of symbolic domination of the space of elites, no? And you can see clearly that in zones like the zones for the very, very rich in Polanco and in other zones to the west and the north of the city, no? And also in downtown, where basically people like it's very difficult for people who do not become or who do not identify themselves to this elite to enter in those spaces. They are even hostile, no, to those spaces, and it's quite clear, no. In other research we have made in like more qualitative research with interviews, what everyday average Mexicans have reported is that they even feel like uncomfortable under these zones, no. So this symbolic, for me, it's very interesting, no, to note that when we were analyzing the results, we were shocked, no, that the qualitative research we conduct with interviews was very consistent, no, with what the data has shown us, no, that it's inequality is also a matter of aesthetics and power over the space, no. So that's for me, it's quite big. And finally, what we found, it's a pattern, a very clear pattern between zones, no. Basically, the city is divided in the east and west, no. Basically, the east and southeast zones of the city are dominated by neighborhoods with low income households, whilst the west and the part of the north and a little bit of the south, but very west to the city is dominated by the upper classes or upper middle class. No, downtown is a mixture, but it's increasingly becoming more and more dominated by this emergence of new neighborhoods that are gentrified. No, and that spatial pattern matters. No, because it means that the infrastructure, the investments, all the public services follow that pattern, no? And we can see that the zones that have the lowest level of income didn't have any access to proper infrastructure, for example, no?
There is a curious absence in space for meeting each other, right? So when you have specific zones, as you described, the west and the north to some degree for the middle upper classes, and then the east and the south mostly for the lower income classes. Where do these people meet? Do they ever meet? Do they know each other? Do they know of each other?
Yes. So probably the only convergence point for these classes, particularly in terms of museums and consumption like restaurants, is in downtown. So it's in the zones of the actual Zócalo of Mexico City and the surroundings, because it's a very heterogeneous zone, no? In the sense that you have tourism, different types of people, and the access is very quite easy, no, to get there. So we find that in the center you find some interactions, but as you move out from this center, you start to see that basically each class goes to different zones, no? For example, in terms of education, it's very segregated. The types of schools they're like rich people take their kids to compared to people who have low incomes. Perhaps, for example, public schools such as UNAM, no? The National University of Mexico or National Polytechnic Institute, no? In those zones, there might be some interactions, no? Because there are, just by construction, there are careers and professions that you cannot find in private schools, no? So that's where there is some sort of interaction, no? But it's very limited, no? It's very limited. And basically, part of the idea or the policy insight for us when we did this report was how can we create the conditions for people to start interacting more, no? What are the necessary policy measures to promote that interaction, no? That it's not happening. And when it happens, another thing that it's interesting is, for example, Santa Fe, no? Which is the Santa Fe is like the business neighborhood, no? Very important business neighborhood for all the people, no? And you might find that there is some sort of interaction, but it's not an interaction in equal footing, no? So it's basically to Santa Fe, like if you're a rich people, you go to give an example, not to consume. You see that there are people in the same spot, no? But probably one of them is going there consuming, and the other one is going there working, no? So, for example, a waitress, no, working in a restaurant might come from lower income households, and they might find themselves interacting with people like very rich people, but their interaction is basically an interaction mediated by some sort of power, no?
And I want to come back to the policy question in a moment, but before that, the big question is why? I mean, why do people not interact? Because there's obviously not a big wall between them and or between the neighborhoods, and there's no physical restriction, let's say. What makes specific groups stick to their specific neighborhoods besides what you already mentioned, that some places are just too expensive for some people to attend?
Well, I think in the case of Mexico, it has a historical pattern, in some sense, in which there are like traditional zones dominated by elites, no? I think one of the reasons is its infrastructure. One of other reasons that I think people don't get to know each other is the fact that the transports that the two groups use are very, very different, no? For example, in the case of people who live, for example, in Iztapalapa or in Chalco or in zones that are like more to the east of the city, the public transportation, you might have a subway, but normally you travel by bus, no? By a certain type of bus. Whilst if you live in downtown, you normally will move to Metrobus or to cycling, no? And basically, in the rich zones, the only way you move is by car, no? And I think transportations, it's quite a big determinant of the movement patterns, no? The other one is that we find is education, and normally education, and this was an insight we had when we sort of were analyzing the data but also with studies like qualitative studies. Education creates like a path dependence for a person's life cycle, no? And that basically explains the social mobility, no? If you go to an elite school, no, in Polanco, for example, one of the richest zones in Mexico, you will probably only interact with people, and down the line you will get your very close circle, very hermetic cycle of friends and acquaintances, no, which determine your work, no, and basically, since one of the things that we found is that since school, you already are promoting, no, a certain type of networks that doesn't allow people to move, no, and I think this, when you compare to other experience, even in the U.S., no, which is a country that has high, like not the inequality that has Mexico, but has certain level of inequality compared to Europe. Even in the U.S., you have public schools, no, where people can. There's more heterogeneity in a way, no. Here is very segregated, no, and I think that creates like sort of a path dependency, no.
And it's inheritable in that sense, right? Because the school, you probably don't choose that by yourself when you're 6 years old or 5, and you're sent somewhere, and that already creates a path dependency. And you might send your kids to similar style schools, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and there have been even experiments. I think they did quasi-experiment in India where they compare. They have basically an exchange program where you have in a public school rich people and with the normal or low income households, sort of students, and when they interact with not elite people from their inner circle, they measure their perceptions on inequality and redistribution, and that actually might make an impact, no? I don't recall the details, or there are very technical details of the study, but basically in a nutshell, it showed that actually if you get to know the other, what it's called the other, you are more empathic, you tend to be more empathic, and you can sort of understand certain and sort of deconstruct even some perceptions that you have in terms of inequality, no, or support for redistribution, no. And I think in Mexico this is key, no, because part of in order to tackle inequality, you need to start changing perceptions about that, particularly the elite, no, has on Mexicans that were less fortunate than them, no. I think in order to do the policies that you are required, you not only have to win the policy battle, but you also need to win the narrative and the changing, no, certain values and constructions that society as hierarchical as Mexican society has already, no.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, I'm all in for studying perceptions and adjusting them to reality. Let's come back then to this policy dimension there, considering the importance of people understanding how the real society or how society beyond their specific inner circle looks like, and the lack of interaction with other groups or with people that are different from your own inner circle. What can we do to, I don't know, bring them together or to change this situation? Or what is the policy perspective that you adopted in your study?
I think that it's the thing with democracies compared to authoritarian regimes, because an authoritarian regime could say just move them, no, put them together and just make them buried with each other, no. But in democracies, these things might take more time, no. I think in the long term, you need to sort out these patterns of gentrification and the prices of in the housing market. You need to, like, the state government needs to have a central role trying to control those prices. It can be through taxes, it can be to social housing, no, it can be to several types of policies, no. But in the end, a city that has a pattern of in terms of price formation that is excluding basically poor people from the city, it's a city that has not a very good chances of success to be a city that is integrated, no. So I think that on the one hand, you need to provide certain policies to make that, like, no matter your income, you have certain access to zones that are part of, or like central to the city, no. So I think on one hand you have that. On the other hand, I think one of the things that sort of was encouraging was public spaces in terms of parks and city and museums, no. I think that trying to promote, and you can see it in Mexico City, no, rather than to promote the construction of malls, for example, that are normally constructions of consumption places that are by their own nature exclude some people from that space, building parks, building museums, building things where everyone can have access and are actually cheap or free. It's a good policy to sort of integrate, no. So I think that promotion of public spaces of culture and recreation, no, open to everyone, like public goods, no, in a way, over spaces of consumption, might also create these, like, reduce, no, the barriers, the entry barriers for different social groups, no. And finally, I think, so for me, education is key, no? And for this, I don't have a clear answer. One of the, like, there has been even in some economists think that private education should be, like, exclude or very limit in order for people sort of to go to the same places. I don't think that in Mexico it's feasible, but I do think that we should be doing something in education to be more integrate our spaces, no? Particularly not only in early education, but also in public schools. So, for example, public universities and public high schools should have some sort of program to trying to get together different social groups, no? And this, you can see this, for example, in high schools from UNAM University. So they make you an exam, and basically you select your own high school doing the exam, no? But as you can imagine, there is a self-selection process, no? Where people who are better off normally go to the spaces that are better off, and then it's sort of reproducing that same inequality, no? So policies to integrate different groups definitely should be encouraged. But I mean, this thing about trying to make people to get together is, I think it's a long-term policy issue, no?
Before we come to close, I'd like to ask you what made you get interested in these subjects in the first place. You were maybe walking one day on the street and you saw that something, or how did you get interested in researching these subjects?
Yes, one, it was sort of an empirical observation I made, and another one was sort of out of intellectual curiosity, no? So the empirical observation is that actually they were very close where I live in Coyoacán, which is let's say better, like it's a good neighbor, a neighborhood who have access to public services, no? And just 10 meters from my apartment, you have a street, no? Just crossing the street, everything it's completely different, no? Everything it's different. The access to, for example, water, it's very different, and basically the only thing that it's a different neighborhood, no? It's a different. So I live in the municipality of Coyoacán, and if I cross the street, I'm in the municipality of Iztapalapa, for example, no? And even changing this administrative barrier, the type of public goods, the type of infrastructure you have, everything changes, no? The houses are completely different, no? One of them are apartments, and even some houses that are, I mean, it's not Polanco, it's not a very rich zone, but they're fine, no? You have, for example, police patrolling every night, no? You have a nice place, I think, to live, no? A safe place, no? And as you cross over, like, instead of apartments, you have social housing. Instead of houses, you have houses, but it's not houses built by these big companies, construction companies, but self-made houses, no? So it's complete different panorama, no? And you can see, I mean, this is an example, perhaps a very silly example, but you can see this in every like part of Mexico City, no? There are even zones in downtown still in the center of the city that has that pattern, no? There are in a way some like towns that are trapped in the city, no? Where you have even in Santa Fe, no? You can see in this business center, you can see that, no? That you cross one street and then you have what we call lost cities, ciudades perdidas, which are similar, I think, to a favela in a way, Brazilian favela in a way, and that's something that just empirically is striking, no? And the other motivation was the use of big data, no? So for me, you know, the trend is that this type of data is used by commercial purposes, and I think that I very strongly believe that we can use data for good purposes, no? Not only to make you buy products or specific social network, your data, no? When you are answering a quiz or whatever, I think there is actually another way of using the data, which is using this type of data for solving social problems, no? And what I was excited was the opportunity, luckily, to use this data to trying to unravel certain problems and trying to provide some policy insights, no? So for me, that was quite good.
And finally, where does it go from here? I mean, now that you've tried using this data and it works, and are you going to make another study about things like that, or what would you like to research?
Yeah, I mean, data available in Mexico as a country, not only Mexico City, is actually not as good. It's more scarce than in other countries. So, for example, the MIT just published an atlas of inequality for like 10 cities, 10 different cities. And if you look at this atlas of inequality, it's amazing, no? For us, that was a big inspiration, no? Seeing that you can see like a bar in Brooklyn, no? Who goes there, you know, and because they have this type of data, no? In Mexico, sadly, you don't have that amount of data to do this. But I think that for more personally would be interesting to see other cities. We have this tradition in Mexico to be Mexico City centered, and there are other places, no? For example, another very highly stratified society, but different than Mexico, would be Monterrey, for example. So Monterrey would be interesting to see Monterrey, Guadalajara, León, other cities, no? Other like big cities, no? Ciudad Juárez, other cities that had other patterns of development, other history, no? To try to see if this thing repeats, no? Across cities. My hunch or my hypothesis is that it does, no? That normally big cities in Mexico tend to be cities that are very good in a lot of ways, but also that are where you can see the class difference very clearly, no? And another thing that it would be interesting, but we don't have data at least now to do, is to actually trying to do more gender analysis combining this. So one of the key issues is that, and it was a shame that we haven't had the opportunity to do this, is to do gender analysis, because another hypothesis that I have is that women and men move differently. The routes, the type of public transportation, the time where you spend in spaces, the type of spaces you use, and at what hour, like men and women, we use differently the spaces. And that's basically determined by basically social norms, no? And insecurity and the problems that we know that we have in Mexico, no? But unfortunately, the data didn't have that, no? So that would be something that would be excited to see, no?
Yeah, fascinating topic, and we hope you'll find some data so that next time you can tell us more about these different patterns of mobility among genders and different cities, maybe all kind of other dimensions that you might be able to analyze. Thank you, Diego, so much for telling us something about spatial inequality and how segregated cities like Mexico City work or don't, and what could be done about it.
Many thanks for the invitation, Alice.
Thank you, everybody, for watching another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Alice Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel. And if you like these subjects, or if you want to learn more about inequalities, please leave us a comment, watch another episode, and join us again next week for another discussion about these important topics. We hope you have a good week, and see you soon. Bye-bye.